Good morning and welcome to our Sunday morning Bible class. We are going to continue our study of Christian evidences and continue to go through our Bible correspondence course, which is again created by Apologetics Press. It is available through their website in digital format, or you can purchase it through their store. Again, I would say please continue studying and looking at that material, because the more knowledge we have, the better we can fight Satan and all the devices that he's put out there for us. So we're going to continue our study today, but as kind of a recap, what we've talked about is we started this idea off is that there are these people called unbelievers. These people that do not believe in God or do not believe in a creator of any kind. So we talked about the different types of unbelievers. We talked about reasons why people unbelieve. And then we kind of hopped in some topics. So you got to say, well, why are we discussing this? Why are we going through this? What is the reason for it? Well, there's a good reason for it, because as we find ourselves talking to people out in the world, we find out that there's more and more unbelievers, people that don't even believe in the Bible to begin with. And what we have to do as Christians, we have to have in our toolbox of Christian tools, is we need to be able to talk to people, to be able to discuss this material with them, to get them to the point where they believe in the Bible, and then we can go to the Bible and answer any question that they need. So we've spent a lot of time on discussing that. We've talked about the idea of the existence of God, and we talked about cause and effect and how the universe was created. Then we talked about some different designs that we see throughout the universe and on earth and in the human body, about how you can see that there is a design, and if there is a design, then that means there must be a designer. We talked about last week about how you got morals and ethics and these rules that we go by and how we live our life, things that we identify as being right and wrong, and where did it come from? So we talked about this full idea of this existence of God, that we can say, all right, now we've got all the facts. There is an existence of a God or a designer. We need to know more. So the next topic we need to address is this idea of creation versus evolution. And this will be a two-part thing, and I know this is probably the last Sunday, unless the elders decide to continue the virtual meeting. But what we'll be doing is we're going to go through part one, and then in our college age class, and of course our 5th and 6th grade class, when we meet again, we'll continue with part two. But the reason why we bring up creation versus evolution is because in today's time, these are kind of the two leading beliefs of how the origin of the universe was created. So let's kind of hop into this and talk more about it. First of all, these are two very different and totally opposite explanations for the origin of the universe and the origin of life in the universe. Now, this is obviously, some information that human beings want to know. How did the universe begin? How did life begin? Where did it come from? Well, there's these two different concepts. First one, obviously, is called evolution. And according to the theory of evolution, the universe is self-contained, which means that everything in the universe has come into being through some random process without any kind of supernatural involvement. In other words, whatever has been created or made within the universe was already in the universe. All right, this view says that the origin and development of the universe and all of the life in it can be explained by time, chance, and this continuing natural processes, these things that are still happening. But according to the evolutionary theory, all living things have arisen from a single-celled organism, which in turn had arisen from something non-living, such as an amino acid or a protein. So here's what we're saying, and we'll dive into more of this later, is what we're saying is when life began, it came from an amino acid or a protein or something of that nature, which is non-living according to our definition, and then it turned into something living, and eventually developed into where we are today. So let me pause here for just a moment and let's talk about this. Now, obviously, at this point in time, I'm not using the Bible. I'm not using Scripture to talk about these things. This is going to end up sounding more like a science class. But again, this is very important information, because when you go out and talk to people, this is the proof. This is the evidence. This is the information that you need while talking to them, because they might not believe in the Bible yet. You have to give them all this evidence that leads up to say, hey, the Bible is inspired. It came from God. It came from this designer. This is true. So we have to go through these different pieces and parts. So we're going to go to science class for a little bit. Bear with me, stay with me, but it will all make sense. So that is first, we're talking about evolution. All right, now let's talk about this idea of creation. According to this theory of creation, the universe is not self-contained, which means that everything in the universe has come into being through the design, the purpose, and deliberate acts of a supernatural creator. In other words, this did not happen by chance. This just didn't, happen to come to fruition. It was done on purpose. It was deliberate. And then, and as we know about when he created this, he's using processes that are not continuing today. When he created the universe and earth and all life on earth, this is when he set it into motion. So what we're saying here is, when God created the heavens and the earth and everything associated with that, he set things in motion. This is not a continuing thing in which he's adjusting today. He set it in motion, kind of like the weather and all those things associated with that. So let's keep going here. So in order to examine properly these two different models, they must be defined in general terms, and then they must be compared with the available facts. So let's look at evolution for just a second. It says this includes the evidence for a gradual appearance of present life over eons of time, with complex kinds of life emerging from simpler kinds and ultimately from non-living matter. So this is where we're going to dive back to what we talked about just a second ago. What we're saying here is, in the beginning of life, they're suggesting that something like a protein or an amino acid, which is classified as non-living, from there it turned into a more simpler kind of life, and then eventually evolved into a more complex kind of life, is what they're suggesting. Now, on the contrast here, you've got creation, which we basically include the evidence for a sudden appearance of complex life. In other words, complex life began immediately. So the creation model denies this idea of what they call a vertical evolution, which is the emergence of a complex organism from a simple organism, and also the ability to change between kinds. In other words, they're suggesting that that an amoeba can gradually change into a man. So they're saying a simple organism can develop into a complex, and then not only that is it can change kinds. We completely deny that in the creation model. However, the creation model does not challenge the horizontal evolution, which this is the formation of species or subspecies within created kinds, or genetic variations. And what we're talking about here is, like, there are some species of birds that as time goes along and genetics presents itself, that they gradually get smaller beaks. Or we've seen moths or certain species of moths change colors over time. We're not denying that part. We're not challenging that. We see that through, like I said, genetics and all kinds of subspecies. So you got to ask yourself, well, Michael, why are we talking about this? Why are we, diving into this idea of creation versus evolution? Well, in one way or another, this issue touches almost every field of study and every part of life. For example, we have science books that are getting written that have both views, or sometimes only one view. We got various states have discussed enacting laws that would not allow the teaching of only one theory of origin, even though we know mostly it's being taught of evolution. We know news medias, science associations, teachers associations, and even political associations have all become involved in what should be taught. So you guys say, well, why are we talking about this? Is because it's involved in our normal lives and it needs to be discussed. Because at one point in time, there was very little dispute between these two views. But what we find out is if you look at some of the polling data that is available out there, you will see that the majority of people don't believe this evolutionary idea. And as time goes along, as you look at these different pieces of polling data, you will see that people are gradually shifting to evolution very shortly, but most people do not believe in evolution. They believe in more of a creation, and this is upsetting this evolutionist. They're being upset because they want you to believe what they believe. And what's interesting is, however, after 150 years of Darwinism, in other words, Darwinism is the person, Darwin is the one that came up with the idea of evolution. But we find out that after 150 years, rapidly growing number of scientists have become convinced that the natural laws, those laws we've discussed in previous lessons, and processes that we know absolutely exclude the possibility that the universe could have created itself. We've already talked about all the different laws and how, if you're going to believe this into law, then you cannot believe that evolution is correct. You have to believe that there is a design or a designer. So that's why we're talking about this. So let's check out this idea of the credibility of the creation model. They've got this thing called the law of biogenesis. And what this states is that life comes only from previous life of its own type of kind. In other words, a human being will produce a human being. So through the years, thousands of scientists in various fields of study have documented the truthfulness of the law of biogenesis. You may tell you how I know this? Well, that's because of the word law. If it said theory of biogenesis, that would be a different situation. But when it says law, this is something that has been proven time after time after time. But it's interesting that if you go and you talk to college students that are in some of these fields and things of that nature, they will be taught about this thing from a guy named Louis Pasteur, and his work is on this false notion of spontaneous generation. And what we're saying here is the idea that life arises on its own from non-living sources. In other words, life does just not spontaneously create itself. So, and if you look at what we talked about earlier about evolution, they're suggesting that from something non-living, like an amino acid or a protein, you get something living, and then it eventually develops into something complex. Well, this man's work basically proves that it's not correct, that it's not true, that you cannot just spontaneously create something. But with the very next breath, they are teaching evolutionary processes. These same teachers in the very next lesson, they're saying, oh, you can't have spontaneous generation, but let me tell you about evolution where you have to have spontaneous generation. It makes no sense. So in attempt to prove this evolutionary idea, scientists have created experiments to try to form life from non-living matter. They're trying to prove that, hey, it can happen. So because if they do, then they can prove Mr. Lewis, they can prove his idea wrong. Well, what's interesting, so far, no one yet has created life, and they haven't came anywhere close. So what we find out here is they're proving his idea more and more. They're proving this law of biogenesis because cows give rise to cows, birds to birds, tulips to tulips, corn to corn, and so on. Honestly, it sounds ridiculous having to discuss this, that somebody thinks that out of something or out of nothing, you can create life. It makes no sense with everything we know as law. But in recent years, evolutionists have tried to create a new naming system for this law, because they not because they've been able to disprove this law of biogenesis, but that evolution can never be true if the law of biogenesis is true. Just like we talked about it, he's already proved that you can't get nothing, you can't get something out of nothing, and so as long as this law is true, evolution never can be. So they're trying their best to confuse us and others to say that that's not that's more of a theory of biogenesis is what they're trying to say. No, that's not right. It is the law of biogenesis, and don't change it. Then we've got this idea of natural selection. Now, in November of 1859, Charles Darwin published a book called The Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection. This is where the theory of evolution has came from. And what he does is Darwin states natural selection is the daily and hourly scrutinizing every variation, even the slightest, rejecting that which is bad, preserving and adding up all that is good, silently and sensibly working at the improvement of each organic being. Now, that's a lot of words, but I bet you've heard it differently. And what way you've heard it is this is the survival of the fittest. In other words, the most fit creatures survive. Those that are not fit to be able to survive, they die off, or they don't make it. So it's called natural selection. Natural selection, however, does not explain how those creatures came to be the most fit. It just says that there is survival of the fittest. And I don't think that there's any objection here. I know creationists have no objection to the idea of natural selection as a mechanism for eliminating, non-adapt organisms. I don't see any reason to say that, there's not this survival of the fittest. As a screening device for getting rid of the unfit, natural selection represents the creator's plan for preventing harmful mutations from affecting and destroying the entire species. In other words, our creator, God, put this process into place to say, okay, if you're not fit for the environment, you don't progress. You don't make it. I think that's clearly obvious in this case. However, the fact that an organism is adapted to its environment tells us absolutely nothing about how it came to be adapted. In other words, we don't know, according to this idea of natural selection that he's presenting, how this came to be. How is he making this happen? It certainly cannot explain the vast complexity of life around us. This survival of the fittest doesn't tell me how the universe was created. It doesn't tell me how a non-living organism, or not even an organism, a non-living thing produced a living organism and then eventually developed into a complex organism. His idea of natural selection does not explain that. It doesn't come anywhere close to it. Then they're going to try to do this idea of genetics. And genetics is one of the newest and certainly one of the most exciting sciences of today's time, is to be able to see and get into this interesting storehouse of genetic information. We know with genetics you've got, a person's hair color, their body type, are they tall, are they short, are they big boned like I am, right? What kind of information is in these genetics? And what studies have shown is that this hereditary information is found within the living cell, is placed there in a chemical code. We talked about that a few weeks ago, about how there's this code that identifies that person or that cell or that organism. And what's great about it is this code is universal. It's not only just in human beings, but it's also in animals and plants and things of that nature. So one of the most important points in regards to genetics, so far as the creation evolution controversy is concerned, is that the genetic code's chemical instructions are copied faithfully time after time. So when a flower produces a flower, it's copied exactly. Birds to birds, humans to humans. We see this ourselves without having to break down the genetics. We can see, this person being a son or daughter of this person, because we see that genetic instruction flowing down. So today, the alleged mechanism of evolution is natural selection, which we just talked about the survival of the fittest, plus what they're going to call genetic mutations. Because evolution without a mechanism is like a car with no engine. It's not going to go anywhere. Because if you look at the evolution on the top of the scale there, you're going to see that it has no bearing. You got the law of biogenesis. You got all this other ideas that it has nowhere to go. So they have to come up with something. They have to have some excuse to try to explain this. Well, so they're going to blame it on genetic mutations. Well, regardless, evolutionists will still continue this idea, but they must admit that mutations are errors in DNA, and they are almost always harmful. In other words, we're not saying that this is genetics or your genes evolving. They're actually errors, things that are going wrong, and are almost always harmful. And so what we're saying here is when we look at these mutations that do happen in genetics, there's three different types. It's either good or bad or neutral. Well, if you look at the idea of neutral, well, neutral has no value. So we can kind of throw that out. So if you look at all the other mutations that happen in genetics, is 99% of them are harmful. In other words, they're bad. So there's only 1% that could possibly be good. Let's talk more about that. I want you to consider the following here. Is first of all, mutations are random. There's no way to control mutations, nor to predict with accuracy when they might occur. In other words, nature is not selecting them at all. These are random. It is chance is what's happening here. So there is no natural selection happening here. Also, mutations are very rare, and one of their own scientists said this: it is probably fair to estimate the frequency of a majority of mutations in higher organisms between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in a million per gene per generation. So we're saying this is very rare for a mutation even to happen. And then, of course, we'll say this: good mutations are very, very rare. Again, remember we talked about this idea of 99% of harmful. That came from this guy named Herman Mueller. And according to what he said is, accordingly, a great majority of mutations, certainly well over 99%, are harmful in some way. So we're seeing here that they can't blame natural selection and genetic mutation as being what is continuing life, what's creating life, which is changing from a bird coming into a human being or an ape into a human being. That makes no sense, because 99% of those mutations, which very, very rarely happen, they're bad most of the time. So mutations may be compared to accidents. In other words, they're more likely to wreck a car than to build one. So we're saying that this is not a good leg to stand on. But basically, say that mutations are part of the natural selection is in introducing something that cannot remotely be correct. They have zero leg to stand on. So what is our conclusion here on part one? What we're saying here is we've learned that creation is a legitimate scientific theory that deserves serious consideration. We've proven the facts. We've given a lot of facts so far about showing that there is design here. And if there is design, then we know that there must be a designer. We talked about that idea that someone must have created the universe, but for that to happen, they have to be outside the universe and be superior to that. Well, if you look at this idea of everything that we've presented, that's very legitimate. That makes a whole lot of sense with all the facts that were provided. And the available evidence points to design rather than to a random chance over billions of years. I mean, we all know about chance. We all know about the likelihood of things. But what they're wanting us to suggest, basically suggesting to us, is they want us to believe that over billions and billions of years, something just magically happened and life started from non-life. It started life, and it was a simple life, but after that simple life, it eventually developed into a complex organism. That just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. That's not legitimate. So with that being said, that's what brings us to part two, where we'll dive more into this idea of creation versus evolution. So I would again like to encourage you guys to continue to study these lessons and look at them on Apologetics Press website. Like I said, if I have the ability, I would definitely love to go into part two and go further. After this part two, that's when we start getting into the Bible. We'll get an introduction to the Bible. And the reason for doing this is because, again, we want to get this full picture, because not everybody we talk to today believes in God, believes in the Bible. We need to start with these unbelievers, and honestly, I believe that that's the reason why we have so many unbelievers today, is because we're not addressing them. I think we're too busy trying to address people that already believe in God or believe in the Bible, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't. I'm just saying that, we've got to concentrate on both groups, because obviously the unbelievers are getting larger and we see sin just growing rampant in the world. I think we definitely need to take care of it. So I think this study is really good. If I don't get to continue, I would suggest you guys continuing going lesson after lesson. I would encourage you to go and check them out on their website, because they also do have questions and kind of like a quiz at the end. That way that can kind of test your knowledge, because I think this will be valuable if you have a coworker, a friend, a family member that you'd like to talk to. I think this will help them out a whole bunch. With that being said, I hope you guys stay healthy and you have a good week. Thank you.
Good morning and welcome to Bible class. This morning we're going to continue our study in the book Out With Doubt by Kyle Butt. This morning's lesson begins with a quote from Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 2, which reads as follows: "You shall not add to the word which I command you, nor take it from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you." This morning's lesson deals with the idea of, does the Bible leave room for evolution? And over the years, there's been a lot of debate. Was it evolution that created the world? Was it creation? Are the two intertwined? And there are several people who try to intertwine both creation and evolution and say that the Bible leaves room to insert evolution into the creation that God made. So this morning we're going to look at this chapter, and it'll explain in detail some of the theories that are there and clear it up and truly show that there is no room in the Bible for evolution. So let's begin. It is very unpopular in the field of science to believe that God created the world in 6 literal 24-hour days. In fact, according to most scientists, the universe took billions of years to form, and thus it would be absurd to believe that it was created in just 6 days. Because the prevailing idea of the ancient cosmos, many people have tried to find ways to fit evolution and its billions of year time frame into the Bible account of creation. In essence, they want to continue to say they believe in God and the Bible, but they also want to say that they believe in certain parts of evolution as well. They want to have their cake and eat it too. So the question arises, can both the Bible and evolution be true? Those who claim to believe in both evolution and the Bible generally are known as theistic evolutionists. Theistic comes from the word theos, which means God. Thus, theistic evolution is the view which suggests that God does exist, but that evolution is true too. God simply used evolution to produce the universe and its inhabitants. The obvious place to start an investigation into this matter would be the introduction of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1. The introduction of any sentence, story, or book is extremely important. For instance, if your mother really wants to get your attention, she'll likely will introduce the sentence with your name, "John Allen Thomas, you better straighten up." Introductions are important because they often determine whether you decide to pay attention to the rest of the story. This is no less true of the introduction of the Bible. The first few chapters of Genesis tell the interesting and important story of the origin of the universe. The first 2 chapters of the Bible, for example, tell how God created the heavens and the earth, and all the animals, plants, and humans that existed. His creative activities lasted 6 consecutive days, and on the 7th day, he rested from those activities. Exodus chapter 20, verse 11 sums it up like this: For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. The Bible states quite clearly that everything in the universe, whether in the heavens or on the earth, was created in 6 days. It is here that the Bible and evolution encounter their first major conflict. Evolution claims that everything in the universe came into being by a gradual process that took billions of years, while the Bible says it took only 6 days. In order to fit evolutionary time into the Bible, billions of years must be inserted into the first few chapters of Genesis. Without such vast stretches of time, evolution is impossible. But where and how can it be added to the biblical text? The fact of the matter is, there are only 3 possible places to insert the billions of years required by evolution. 1. Before the creation week of Genesis. 2. During the creation week. Or 3. After the creation week. Let's examine each of these options. Before the creation week, known as the gap theory. Throughout the years, people have searched for a way to place the time necessary for an ancient earth before the creation week. The gap theory was proposed to do exactly that by suggesting that God's original creation of the world actually occurred in Genesis 1 verse 1. It included a fully functional earth complete with animals, plants, and even humans who lived before Adam. However, that creation, or so the theory goes, was destroyed as a result of Satan's disobedience and rebellion. The war between Satan and God supposedly was fought on earth and left this planet without form and void. Genesis 1 verse 2. This would account for the billions of fossils found within the earth, since they are remnants of the gap destruction. Beginning in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, God then recreated the earth in 6 literal 24-hour periods. While this may be a fascinating theory, it cannot possibly be true if the biblical record is taken at face value. First, where in the Bible do we read about the original creation having taken place prior to the one recorded in Genesis 1 verse 1? There is no such information provided within God's Word. Second, where do we read in the Bible about any war taking place on earth between Satan and God? Such an idea is not to be found within the Scriptures. Third, the gap theory blatantly contradicts Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the seventh. If God made everything in 6 days, how many things did He make before those days? The answer, of course, is none. Fourth, the gap theory is false because it states that humans existed prior to Adam and Eve. Yet the inspired apostle Paul said that Adam was the first man, 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 45, and that death entered into the world as a direct result of Adam and Eve's sin, 1 Corinthians 15:21, Romans 5:12, and Romans 8:20 through 22. If the gap theory is correct, a band of sinful people lived and died many years before Adam. The simple fact of the matter is, Paul and the gap theory cannot both be right. Theory number 2. During the creation week, the day-age theory. Not everyone tries to insert time into the biblical text by using the gap theory. Some have argued that the days discussed in Genesis were not literal 24-hour periods, but instead were lengthy eons of time. After all, they say the word translated day in Genesis 1 can have up to 7 different meanings, and on rare occasions it can refer to a long period of time. So, how long were the days of creation week really? According to those who advocate day-age theory, the creation week was composed of long eons of time, each of which consisted of millions or billions of years. Could that be the case? No. The author of Genesis wanted his readers to understand in no uncertain terms that the 6 days of creation were literal 24-hour periods. Here are the reasons we know that. First, the writer defined the word day, the Hebrew word yom, by saying it was composed of an evening and a morning. Whenever that phrase is used with the word day in parts of the Old Testament that are not prophetic, it always means a 24-hour day, no exceptions. Second, whenever a number comes before the word day in the Old Testament non-prophetical literature, like Genesis 1, it always means a literal 24-hour period. Third, whenever the word day appears in a plural form, yamim, the Hebrew word, in the same type of literature, it always means a literal day. In fact, the Old Testament uses this word more than 700 times, and always means a literal day in its non-prophetic uses. Thus, when Exodus 20, verse 11 says, "For 6 days, yamim, the Lord made the heavens and the earth," there can be absolutely no doubt that the text is speaking of 6 literal days. Fourth, the writer of Genesis had other ways of saying that the periods were long eon. Let me start off. Fourth, the writer of Genesis had other ways of saying that the periods were long eons of time. He could have used the Hebrew word dur, which means long periods of time, but he did not. Instead, he employed the word day, modified it with evening and morning, put numbers before it, and made it plural, as in Exodus 20, verse 11, and Exodus 31, verse 17. Moses used practically every means at his disposal to show that the days were not long periods of time, but instead were literal 24-hour periods. Thus, the idea that billions of years needed for evolution might have occurred during creation week simply cannot be defended. But what about 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8? With the Lord, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. Isn't this New Testament passage teaching that to God a day is a very long time? To answer this question is no, it is not. Let's take a look at the passage. In 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8, the apostle is not addressing the days of Genesis, chapter 1. If you begin reading in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 1, you will notice that Peter was not talking about the week of creation, but was speaking of the last days when Christ will return. Some people said that Christ was taking too long to come back. Peter wanted his readers to understand that God is not bound by time. God can do more in a day than humans can do in 1,000 years. Or God may wait 1,000 years to do what humans think he should do in a day. It is interesting to note that God recognizes the difference between an earthly day and an earthly 1,000 years. It's also interesting to note that Peter did not say that a day is 1,000 years or 1,000 years is a day. Instead, he stated that a day is as 1,000 years and 1,000 years is as one day. God always has recognized the difference between an earthly day and a year. Genesis 1:14 is a good example of this, because God spoke of the sun and moon being useful to humans for signs and for seasons, for days and for years. If the days of Genesis 1 are not 24 periods, but billions of years, then what would a year be? The passage in 2 Peter 3:8 shows that God is able to communicate the difference to human beings. And what exactly did he say the time periods of Genesis 1 were? They were days. Theory 3. After the creation week. We've seen that the time needed for evolution to take place cannot take place during the 6 days of creation because they're little 24-hour periods. We also have seen that the time cannot take place before the 6 days of creation because the Bible says that God created everything in 6 days. The only possible place left for the eons of time is after the creation week. Some have suggested that perhaps Adam and Eve were in the garden for many years before they sinned, and that vast amounts of time might have been placed there. But Genesis 5:5 restricts the amount of time that Adam and Eve were in the garden to a maximum of 930 years, since Adam died at that age. Furthermore, we know that days and years already were being counted before Adam and Eve sinned, because Genesis 1:14 uses both those terms in a literal, everyday sense. One other item needs to be discussed. It is extremely difficult to insert the time necessary for evolution after the creation week, since the biblical genealogies, which we discussed in the previous chapter, limit that time to a few thousand years. There simply is no room in the genealogy for millions or billions of years, which probably explains why very few people attempt to place the time necessary for an old earth after the creation week. Other equally false ideas have been suggested, but the material presented here and in chapter 8 provides an airtight case which shows that the earth is only about 6,000 years old. The billions of years required for evolution to have occurred find no place within the Bible. So in conclusion, many theories have been concocted to allow people to believe in evolution and yet still try to maintain belief in the Bible as God's Word. However, all of these theories fall short, and it soon becomes clear that either the Bible is true or evolution is true, but they cannot both be true, since they teach contradictory concepts. A person cannot logically believe that the Bible is true and then at the same time believe that evolution is true. It is either or proposition, not both and. Remember, science books and theories are rewritten every few years, but the word of the Lord endures forever. 1 Peter 1:25. So I hope that clears some things up, and some of these theories I've never heard before. It's very interesting reading them. If you have any questions, just feel free to contact me and we can discuss it or look over what was said in this book. I hope you have a great day.